morning, back again, 30th of June 2024. Next speaker up is Arthur Scargill, the man himself. 86-year-old Arthur came into building on crutches, looking very weak and looking very, not ill, but not too well, if you know what I mean. In failing health, I'd describe it. Up he got, did his usual 45 minutes of speaking, and I've recorded it, so if you want to watch it, watch it. If you don't. I don't think I'll ever be able to record him in where he got such a captive audience. We're quiet, you can hear the pins up as he's talking, that's how much respect he has. So Arthur Scargill, what can I say? Simply the best. Here we go.
Are never ever to be seen doing anything, with one or two honourable exceptions. Arthur led from the front in the 70s, in the 80s, and continues to be our leader to this day. The wonderful Arthur Scargill.
First of all, comrades, I'm sure you'll forgive me. I'm 86 years of age, I'm disabled, but I'll do my best. I'm here today to honour the miners and their families who in 1984-5 fought the greatest workers' fight since the days of the Merthyr Tydfil side rising, the Tolpuddle martyrs, the Newport Chartists, the Featherstone martyrs, and the suffragettes. I honour, as I always have, the young miners of yesteryear and the magnificent Women Against Pit Closures who for a year were to the forefront of our struggle to save pits, jobs and mining communities. Just one side there, two legends in football totally supported us. One was Jackie Charlton. His wife manned or womaned the soup kitchen in Worsborough for a year, and Jackie loaned his cars, he had to the strike committee to go parking. And when they approached him and asked him, did you support the miners in their strike? He said, I bloody well did, I were a miner myself. And so we've got people in history who were on our side. My day today is going to be to tell you facts that you've never heard before. During the early summer of 1982, in the first months of my presidency, I was told, obviously in great confidence, by the National Coal Board's Director of Public Relations, Jeff Kirk, that the NCB and the Tory government intended to launch a pit closure programme in the autumn of 1982. On the basis of our union's experience, and without betraying the source of my information, I warned that a pit closure attack on our industry was illuminating. On the evening of the 1st of November 1982, Don Loney, the National Union of Mine Workers Chief Executive, came to my office with a sealed package. He said it had been sent by the Deputy Chairman of the National Coal Board, John Mills. I opened it and I read it. I think you've got a right to listen to what it said. The following morning, I reported the meeting to the National Executive Committee about the document had been handed. This is what it said. The Coal Board intended, with government approval, A, to close 30 pits which were described as uneconomic and, according to the board, accounted for operating losses exceeding 200 million, and B, to close 75 short-life collieries, bracket including Quadrant in South Wales, which had already been closed. There was a note included in the list of short-life collieries. 10 of the so-called uneconomic pits referred to in A above meant that the total number of threatened collieries was 95. In presenting this information to the NEC, I pointed out that these documents were actually dated March 1982. They were given to me, of course, at different points later in 1982. I pointed out that these documents had exposed the fact that the board had been telling lies. There's no question about that. They'd been denying for months. There was no hit list or closure plan. The NEC was shocked. They were really shocked to learn this. And they agreed that the board supply of documents to pit closures should name each individual threatened pit and hand it to us. None of the information we asked for was ever supplied. The evidence I've been given didn't surprise me. Alongside the government memories of defeat by the NUM in 1969, 1972, 1974, yes, and 1981 miners' strikes had experienced for the Tories a stunning defeat, particularly in 1981 when NUM members took strike action without NEC permission or a ballot or even a conference decision against pit closures, which forced the government without a ballot into an humiliating settlement. The union was now warning that an attack was on its way, and we were preparing for a fight back. The National Executive Committee agreed to call a special National Delegate Conference to determine our response. On the 21st of October 1983, we held a delegate conference which voted unanimously for a national full overtime ban. And just in case somebody from the Sun's popped in, that means everybody. Unanimous. Over the next 4 months, the ban had an extraordinary impact. It cut coal stocks to about the same level as they had been in the successful and unofficial miners' strike in 1981. On the 1st of March 1984, following discussions with the government, the National Coal Board directors in 4 areas announced the immediate closure of 5 pits: Corton Wood and Bullcliff Wood in Yorkshire, Harrington in Durham, Snowdown in Kent, and Pulmaze in Scotland. This action was in breach of the procedures which had applied from 1947 and the Plan for Coal signed in 1974 and signed by the Tory government in 1981. At the National Executive Committee meeting on the 8th of March, 1 week later, Scotland and Yorkshire sought endorsement from the NEC for strike action in their areas. They were every right to do that. They were given our authorisation in accordance with National Rule 41, and the NEC confirmed that any other area, if they wished, could take the same action. On the 12th of March, a number of areas certainly did. 180,000 miners were on strike. I'm fed up of hearing critics saying we picked the wrong time for a strike. Our fight back started in November 1983, an appropriate time just before and the end of that year for the miners to start an industrial action. At a special conference demanded by a number of areas on the 19th of April 1984, delegates rejected a conference decision to vote for a ballot, and they voted to support and to strengthen the 180,000 or 80% of Britain's miners who were already on area strikes in accordance with National Rule 41. Pits were being threatened on an area basis, and miners were taking action on a similar basis and fighting back on an area basis in accordance with rule. From the start, I was convinced that the steel industry and the coking plants should be the area's main target, far more important than power stations or indeed the pits in the few areas that had rejected strike action. On the basis of information I had in 1984, I argued with the leaders on the left in the movement and in the areas on strike that the obvious targets were the steel plants at Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire, Ravenscraig in Scotland, and Port Talbot in South Wales, and the coking plants which supplied them. For reasons, I saw the Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire as a crucial point for a mass picket. My argument was initially rejected by the area leaders, who believed the main target should be areas which had not joined the strike and who had started picketing in areas which had opposed area strikes. It was not until May 1984 that my view about Orgreave was accepted. I'm fed up of reading and listening to so-called historians or experts and media experts who say the miners, quote, walked into a police trap at Orgreave on the 18th of June 2024. It's untrue. Picketing started at Orgreave on the 23rd of May 1984, and by the 27th, thousands of miners, as John has said, and supporters were responding to the call for mass picketing at a coking plant which supplied coke essential for the giant Scunthorpe steelworks. Of course, police numbers grew accordingly. By the 30th of May, the number of police had outnumbered anything that had gone before. The number of pickets had led to a substantial of us being arrested, including me. we have publicly urged our members to join a mass picket on the 18th of June 1984. On that day, 10,000 pickets arrived by early morning. We knew the police would turn out in greater numbers than before. We'd advertised it. We called upon people to join in the mass picket. How did we know? I'll tell you. I had been shown a government order by George Moores, a South Yorkshire County Councillor responsible for the South Yorkshire Police, and I knew that 8,200 police had been deployed to Orgreave. Fact. I saw the document. But we were there for a reason and with a strategy. We didn't simply walk into a trap. We'd worked out how to coordinate our action. 6,000 of our members were deployed on the high ground, like any general in an army will tell you, is the best part, for the high side of the plant, near the Orgreave village, and 4,000 led by Jack Taylor to the low side where the lorries were leaving the plant after breaking the picket line. But we'd also done some other things. From a little shop in Sheffield, I purchased 6 walkie-talkies, many out of date, and distributed them amongst the picket leaders, including Jack Taylor, Sonny Thompson, Dave Douglas, and our NUM film crew. Yes, we had our own film crew at Orgreave on the 18th of June. It's been a long time admitted that the police brutality at Orgreave was a deliberate tactic used by the state to wage war against the National Union of Mine Workers. We were faced with police in full riot gear, with long shields, short shields, truncheons, dogs. There were visored police on horseback carrying long staves which they swung to hit our pickets, miners dressed only in t-shirts, and on one occasion, in the face of a famous photograph, an attempt to hit a young reporter who was simply photographing what was happening. At least 123 pickets were injured. A number had to be hospitalised, including me. 95, including some of the worst injured, were arrested and charged with riot, unlawful assembly, and violent disorder. These charges were discredited and dropped with the acquittal of those who were put on trial. One of the people who was giving evidence, a learned police officer, was confronted with evidence. He said, on the occasion, at approximately 9 o'clock, he said, a colleague of mine in the police with a long shield had a brick thrown at him. It bounced off his shield. It hit the ground and bounced under my long shield and caused me serious injury. At the adjournment, a Welsh barrister representing us came back into court and said, do you know, I've been practicing. We've been practicing with bricks. They don't bounce. He says, first of all, we threw a full brick, didn't bounce. So we threw a half brick, didn't bounce. If bricks didn't bounce, how did the police officer claim he was injured? The judge said, Case dismissed. The tragedy was that the pickets were not prepared after the incident to do things that was necessary. How many people in this room, or indeed in the union or outside, realise that on the 18th of June 1984, the scene and the date of the mass picket, we actually closed the plant. We closed it just as we had done in Saltley in 1972. I saw a telex from the British Steel chairman, Sir Robert Haverson, who had been horrified by the police brutality screened for all to see. A copy of that telex was handed to me by the BBC correspondent Nicholas Jones. I told you I'd name people. And the closure of the plant is referred to by Dave Douglas in his book Goat Dancers. Whilst Dennis Doody, who's in this room today, and a Yorkshire miner and later a UCAT official, recalled hearing the news of the closure on Sheffield Radio. We closed it, just as we had done in Saltley in 1972. The tragedy was, the following day, the pickets were withdrawn. From my hospital bed, using hospital telephone, I turned to every area that was on strike, and I urged the leadership to step up the picketing on the following day, the 19th, in order to increase the pressure as we had done in Saltley in 1972. Had that happened, I've got no doubt that Orgreave would have been closed and Scunthorpe would have made immediate closure. The impact of that and the effect elsewhere would have forced, in my view, the government to settle the strike. 9 years after the strike, my argument that picketing steelworks and coking plants were crucial and it was the government's weakest point was confirmed by none other than Margaret Thatcher. In her autobiography, she devoted 40 pages of a chapter entitled, quotes, Mr. Scargill's Insurrection, unquote. In her autobiography, she wrote of her concern in March 1984, the start of the strike, that steel could be hit by our strike action. She wrote, quote, the CEGB, that's the electricity provider, estimated endurance at about 6 months, but this assumed a build-up to maximum oil burn, that is using oil-fired stations at full capacity, which had not yet begun. Quotes, we had to judge when this should be set in train, because it was certainly being described as provocative by the NUM leadership. She went on to say, we held off because there was a prospect that the NUM moderates might force a ballot. However, I decided on Monday the 26th of March 1984 that this nettle must be grasped. She went on to write, quotes, industrial stocks were of course much lower than those at power stations. The cement industry was particularly vulnerable and important. But it was the BSC, the power generator, whose problems were the most immediate. Their integrated steel plants at Redcar and Scunthorpe would have to close in the next fortnight if supplies of coke and coal were not delivered and unloaded. Port had stock sufficient for no more than 3 to 5 weeks. That's the target we should have gone for. That's the target that could have won it. Not surprisingly, BSC, she said, was extremely concerned as the position changed from day to day, unquote. This was the state of government uncertainty as NUM areas entered the first month of the strike. These were Thatcher's fears from the beginning about steel works at Redcar, Scunthorpe, Ravenscraig, Port Talbot and Llanwern, and coking plants such as Orgreave. Her autobiography, published in 1993, a long time after, proves that my target area had been correct. We've often been told we refuse to negotiate. It's a lie. For 40 years I've been accused of refusing to negotiate a settlement with the coal board and of, quote, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, unquote. This was and is a lie. The NUM settled the strike with the NCB on 5 separate occasions in 1984. On the 8th of June, 8th of July, 8th of July, 10th of September and 12th of October, only to have the NCB renege on these settlements on what we now know was a government instruction. The most important, quote, settlement terms, unquote, were agreed between the leaders of the Pit Deputies Union, NACODS, and the NUM in October 1984 at the offices of the Conciliation Scheme, ACAS. NACODS had just conducted an individual ballot of its members and obtained an 82% vote for strike action. Following the NACODS result, ACAS invited the NCB, the NUM and NACODS to see if there could be a negotiated settlement. After futile discussions with the NCB, I drafted a handwritten proposal in consultation with my 2 closest colleagues, Michael McGuckie and Peter Heathfield. I took that handwritten note, about which, by the way, the union's press officer, who's here today, took a careful note. I took it up to the NACODS leadership, who were in an upstairs room. My proposal, handwritten but right, said this, quote, that the NCB withdraw its pit closure plan, give an undertaking that the 5 collieries earmarked for immediate closure be kept open, and guarantees that no pits will be closed unless by joint agreement if it was deemed to be exhausted or unsafe, unquote. This proposal was accepted by NACODS. I repeat, they accepted it. And it was acceptable to the Conciliation Scheme, ACAS. It was then submitted to the NCB. It was emphasised if the NCB did not accept this joint proposal, the NACODS strike would go ahead. In response, the NCB chairman, Ian McGregor, without a bag over his head, and his team walked out of the ACAS office. Further reconvened discussions were planned, but on the eve of the reconvened discussion, I was to learn that NACOD's leadership had inexplicably reneged on its agreement with the NUM, and instead had reached an agreement with the National Coal Board for an amended colliery review procedure. My NUM colleagues, then included those who are here today, know how useless the amended review procedure turned out to be, because all your pits were closed. What made the difference even more incredible, first time I'm telling it, was that the TUC negotiating team, yes, the TUC had appointed a negotiating team, comprising of Norman Willis, its General Secretary, Ray Buckton, General Secretary of ANUR at that time, and David Basnett of the GMB. These three met with NACODs and pleaded with them and its leaders to stick to the agreement they'd reached with the NUM at ACAS. And they recommended and persuaded the NACOD's officials to go ahead with the strike. Whoever heard previously the TUC doing a thing like that? No explanation has ever been given by NACODs for the U-turn or sellout, which has had terrible historical consequences, leading as it did to the destruction of Britain's deep mine coal industry. I was to discover some more information 8 years later, and it makes the mystery even deeper. On the 17th of July 1992, I took part in a television program. I did many television programs. This one was to be important. It was called Stab in the Dark. It was on the 17th of July 1992. The presenters were David Badell, you'll not have heard these names, Michael Gove, and Tracy MacLeod. And the guests were Labour MP Kate Hoey, Alan Clark MP, a former government minister, and me. When the programme finished, and I'm taking it slowly because you've got a right to know, took me into the green room. And for anybody that doesn't understand what the green room is, it's a lounge where people wait for their cars or whatever, and their drinks are provided. I found myself sitting with Tracy MacLeod, who'd interviewed me. Sitting just a few feet away from me and Tracy MacLeod was Michael Gove with Alan Clark MP, who sat at a nearby table. At a short while later, Alan Clark suddenly rose and moved to sit next to me and Tracy MacLeod. And he said, quote, "Arthur, I'd like to ask you a question." Wait. I said, "What about?" He said, and I'm quoting here, quote, "I've never understood why when the colliery undermanagers called off their strike." At this point I interrupted him. I said, "I think you mean the National Association of Colliery Overmen, Deputies and Shopfirers, NACODs." "Yes," he replied, "that's the one." In October 1994, Margaret had called an emergency committee in which she said, in the light of the Deputies' Union voting to take strike action along with the NUM, we have no alternative but to conclude a settlement in line with what NACODs had agreed with the NUM at ACAS. She said we could present this as a settlement in which ACAS had played the important part. 3 days later, Clark said, quote, "Margaret reconvened the emergency committee which the government had established at the beginning of the strike, panic over. We've arranged with NACODS and the NCB to accept an amended colliery review procedure, and they've agreed to call off their strike when they meet again at ACAS. Alan Clark went on to say that he'd never been able to understand why, when the strike had been effectively won by the NUM, NACODS had called off the strike. I replied, quotes, "I take the same view," unquote. I've no idea whether Tracy MacLeod or Michael Gove were listening to the conversation with Alan Clark, but both were close enough to have done so. I was scribbling notes, as the two journalists had been on All the President's Men in the film, on bits of paper, and I was dictating my record. After leaving the studio, within an hour, I was dictating my record of the conversation to the union's press officer, who's here today. The NACOD's decision in October 1984 has remained a mystery. But throughout the strike, there was more sabotage. Throughout the strike, the NUM's National League leadership was under constant attack from the government, the NCB, the Confederation of British Industry, the Institute of Directors, and of course, television, radio, and the press. And I think all of you will remember or have read that the BBC deliberately turned the film round to purport to say that it was the pickets that charged, when in fact it was the police that charged the pickets. Tragically, as I was to discover, by the summer of 1984, our fight to save pits, jobs and communities was being sabotaged by an unexpected source. The Communist Party of Great Britain, or elements within that party. The Communist Party's industrial organiser was called Pete Carter. I began to learn from CP NUM activists that Carter was going round the coalfields holding meetings at which he urged our Communist Party NUM members to campaign to call off the strike action, return to work and normality without a settlement, giving up our fight for the future. This was very close to the political line that was being pushed by the Labour Party politicians, described by John as the Labour Party that was, but it had become by the Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock. I was furious, and I demanded to see Carter and the Communist Party General Secretary Gordon McLennan, together with Victor McCarthy, who was the only NUM Vice President, but he was also a leading member of the Communist Party. We met in London's County Hotel. The hot atmosphere was hostile, to say the least. I got straight to the point. I demanded of Carter whether what I'd heard from NUM members was true. Was it touring the coalfields, urging miners to campaign for an end to the strike without an agreement, and abandoning our fight against pit closures? Pete Carter looked at me and said straight out, yes, he had been going round the coalfields with that message. The Communist Party General Secretary Gordon McLennan initial response was, that was not the position of the party. It was not Communist Party policy. I must say, I find McLennan's response difficult to accept. Mick McGackie, on the other hand, said forcefully that he knew nothing about it, and he flew in the face of everything the NUM had been fighting for. McGackie appeared very angry. Carter remained perfectly calm and unfazed by my bitterness and by the confusion of Gordon MacLennan. This, you can imagine, made me more angry. When I asked how a communist he could sabotage workers' struggle, he simply said, because I think it was the right policy. At that point, we nearly came to blows. I looked at him and I said, "That right? Fuck off." I got up and walked out of the county hotel. It's impossible to gauge 40 years on the damage this sort of sabotage, seemingly sanctioned by the Communist Party, actually accomplished. On the 21st of February 1985, we held a special delegate conference at which the NEC called upon the trade union movement not to leave the NUM isolated. We called upon all our members to stand firm, and those who were not yet involved to support our union against the government's attempt to destroy us. This resolution was carried unanimously. Inexplicably, by 28th of February, just 1 week later, 5 NUM areas, all thinking the same thing, asked for a recall conference to agree on an immediate return to work without a settlement. Like the decision of NACO's leaders in October 1984, why those 5 NUM areas called for a reconvened conference within a week of voting to continue the strike has never been explained. The recall conference took place on the 3rd of March 1985. The NEC position was for a continuation of the strike as instructed by conference less than a fortnight earlier, and by my reading of the rules and instruction that no member of the NEC could vote against the conference decision to continue the strike. The resolution to call off the strike and return to work was proposed by the South Wales area, and it was seconded by the Durham area. The vote to return to work was carried by 98 votes to 91. I wonder why we had 5 areas all coming together to return to work in line with what was the Labour Party, as it was previously, similar policy. I want to emphasise that the 3 national officials, Mick McGackie, Peter Efield and myself, we all supported to continue the strike. Probably the only time that leaders have said strike and members took a different view. We had strong indications later confirmed that the Cold War government could not have held on beyond July 1985 because 140,000 miners were still out on strike. The miners' strike of 1984-85 remains not only an inspiration for workers, but a reminder of today's trade union leaders of their responsibility to members and the need to come together in direct action to challenge government and employers against all forms of injustice, inequality and exploitation. The real victory of the miners' strike in 1984-85 was the struggle itself. It's a privilege to be here today with men and women who took strike action in 1984 their families, yes, and their children, all who supported the NUM and supported the strike. You marched into history. You entered the pantheon of working class heroes and heroines. I salute you. I was proud to be president.